Hello, we will now begin the graduate seminar for Week 5, focusing on Paul, the reader and writer. The paradox of Paul's literary identity. As strange as it may seem, though Luke devotes nearly half of his history of early Christianity to a person whom he highly esteemed, the apostle to the Gentiles, he nevertheless says nothing whatsoever about Paul being a letter writer. When we immerse ourselves in the narrative of the Acts of the Apostles, we are immediately struck by the sheer volume of space dedicated to the life, travels, and trials of the Apostle Paul. Luke meticulously documents Paul's dramatic conversion, his strategic missionary journeys across the Mediterranean basin, and his impassioned speeches before both hostile crowds and elite Roman magistrates. We see a man constantly on the move, establishing communities, performing miracles, and engaging in profound theological debates. However, amidst this vivid and dynamic portrait, a glaring silence emerges. Luke never once mentions that Paul engaged in the practice of writing letters to the congregations he founded. This omission is absolutely staggering when we consider the monumental impact those very letters had on the formation of early Christian theology and practice. Why would a historian as thorough as Luke completely ignore the epistolary dimension of Paul's ministry? It forces us to reconsider the hierarchy of communication in the ancient world, where the oral proclamation and the physical presence of the apostle were perhaps viewed as paramount, while the written letter was seen merely as a secondary substitute. It also reminds us that Luke's primary theological and historical agenda was to trace the triumphant, outward expansion of the gospel from Jerusalem to Rome, a narrative arc into which the localized, problem-solving nature of Paul's letters might not have neatly fit. Yet on the surface of things, Paul himself offers us no other kind of documents. This brings us to the profound historical irony of our study. The man who is portrayed in our primary historical source almost exclusively as a charismatic orator and itinerant missionary is known to us today entirely through his written correspondence. We do not have diaries, historical chronicles, or systematic theological treatises authored by Paul. What we possess is a collection of ad hoc letters, forged in the heat of pastoral crises, theological disputes, and communal struggles. These texts were not written in an ivory tower, they were deeply embedded in the messy, day-to-day realities of first-century congregational life. They are the artifacts of a leader desperately trying to guide, correct, and encourage communities separated from him by vast geographical distances. Thus, as we analyze what we can learn about Paul from letters, we will be relying exclusively on the Pauline corpus itself. This reality fundamentally shapes our methodological approach to studying Paul. We must become literary detectives, excavating the social, historical, and biographical data hidden within the rhetorical structures of his epistles. We have to reconstruct the opposing arguments, the local contexts, and the cultural assumptions that Paul is addressing. His letters are essentially one half of a complex, ongoing conversation, and our task is to carefully reconstruct the other half. It requires a rigorous analysis of his vocabulary, his theological shifts, and his deployment of persuasive strategies. We must approach the Pauline corpus not merely as a repository of abstract doctrines, but as dynamic, living texts that reflect the intellect, the passion, and the rhetorical genius of their author. Fortunately, when we discuss Paul as a reader or rhetorician, one who practiced the ancient art of persuasion, we have evidence from both Paul and Acts to help us. Here is where the seemingly disparate portraits of Paul in Acts and the epistles beautifully converge. While Acts may omit his letter writing, it provides invaluable context regarding his education, his cultural adaptability, and his capacity to construct powerful arguments before diverse audiences. Luke shows us a Paul who can seamlessly transition from a synagogue sermon rooted in scriptural exegesis to a philosophical discourse on the Areopagus in Athens. This adaptability is the hallmark of a trained reader. When we bring this understanding of Paul's rhetorical prowess back to his letters, we begin to see that his epistles are not just informal notes, they are carefully crafted, persuasive discourses that utilize the sophisticated conventions of Greco-Roman rhetoric. By harmonizing the historical data from Acts with the rhetorical evidence within the epistles, we can construct a holistic and profoundly nuanced portrait of Paul as both a master communicator and a foundational architect of Christian theology. The educational milieu, literacy versus literary ability. To what degree were early Christians educated and literate? The two questions are not identical. When we delve into the social and educational fabric of the first-century Mediterranean world, we must first dismantle our modern assumptions about education and literacy. In our contemporary context, the ability to read and write is fundamentally intertwined with the concept of being educated. However, in the ancient world, the transmission of knowledge, particularly religious and cultural traditions, was overwhelmingly oral and oral. Therefore, a person could be profoundly educated in the sacred texts, the historical narratives, and the ethical traditions of their community without necessarily possessing the mechanical skills of reading and writing. This distinction is absolutely critical when assessing the early Christian communities. We must recognize that the oral transmission of the gospel, the memorization of the sayings of Jesus, and the recitation of Hebrew scriptures formed the bedrock of early Christian education, creating a community of believers who were highly educated in their faith, even if a significant percentage of them could not independently read a manuscript. There were various early Jews who had learned orally a good deal about their faith and a variety of other subjects, yet they could not write, much less write in the lingua franca of the empire, Greek. The Jewish educational system, centered around the synagogue and the home, placed a massive premium on the memorization and recitation of the Torah. Young Jewish men and women would hear the scriptures read aloud and expounded upon week after week. Through this immersive, communal experience, they absorbed complex theological concepts, legal debates, and historical accounts. However, this deep, oral education did not inherently translate into active literacy, particularly in Greek, the language of commerce, administration, and international communication across the Roman Empire. Writing materials such as papyrus and ink were expensive, and the formal training required to master the Greek alphabet, grammar, and composition was largely reserved for the socio-economic elite. Consequently, we must envision a vibrant early church filled with devout individuals who were deeply knowledgeable about their theological heritage but relied on alternative methods for written communication. Some of them employed scribes or amanuenses, or as we would call them, secretaries, to perform their writing tasks. To bridge the gap between their rich oral knowledge and the necessity of written correspondence, many individuals in the ancient world, including early Christians, utilized the services of professional scribes. These amanuenses were highly skilled individuals trained in the mechanics of writing, the conventions of epistolary form, and often the nuances of rhetorical style. Hiring a scribe was a common practice for drafting business contracts, legal documents, and personal letters. In the context of the early church, these secretaries played a vital role in documenting theological arguments, copying sacred texts, and facilitating communication between geographically dispersed congregations. The use of a scribe allowed a person who was orally educated but mechanically illiterate to participate fully in the textual life of the community. We know, from texts like Rom 16:22 that Paul availed himself of some of these secretaries, and to judge by this verse, he used those who were already Christians. The Apostle Paul, despite his extensive education, actively participated in this cultural practice. In his majestic letter to the Romans, we encounter a fascinating personal greeting where Tertius, the writer of the letter, greets the audience in the Lord. This explicit acknowledgement pulls back the curtain on Paul's compositional process. It reveals that Paul did not physically pen the entirety of this complex theological masterpiece himself, instead, he dictated it to Tertius. Furthermore, the fact that Tertius greets the Roman Church in the Lord strongly implies that Paul intentionally selected a fellow believer to serve as his amanuensis. This collaboration between an inspired apostle and a skilled Christian scribe underscores the communal nature of early Christian text production, ensuring that the final document accurately captured the profound nuances of Paul's rhetorical argument while adhering to the highest standards of contemporary literary composition. Yet it is equally clear from texts like Gal 6:11 that Paul could not only read but also write in Greek, and that like so many others, even when he used a secretary, he himself would sign the document and write a concluding postscript. We must not mistake Paul's use of a secretary for an inability to write. On the contrary, Paul frequently asserted his personal authority and authenticated his letters by taking the pen from his scribe to write the closing remarks in his own hand. In his letter to the Galatians, he explicitly draws attention to the large letters he makes when writing in his own hand. This dramatic shift in handwriting served as a powerful, visual verification of the letter's authenticity, protecting the community from forged documents. It proves beyond any doubt that Paul was fully literate, capable of executing the physical act of writing in Greek. His choice to use a secretary was not a matter of necessity born of illiteracy, but rather a practical choice reflecting his status, the immense length of his epistles, and his desire to employ specialized skills to ensure the broad dissemination of his deeply persuasive theology. The complexity of literacy in multicultural settings. The question of literacy in early Christianity is complicated by the fact that Christianity developed and spread in multicultural and multilingual settings and thus incorporated from the start a diversity that forbids the generalizations that are possible for more culturally and linguistically homogeneous groups. When attempting to reconstruct the educational and literary environment of the first-century church, we face an incredibly dynamic and fragmented landscape. Early Christianity did not emerge in a vacuum, nor did it remain confined to a single, monolithic culture. It burst forth from the Jewish heartland of Palestine, rapidly traversing the vast network of Roman roads and trade routes, infiltrating the cosmopolitan urban centers of Asia Minor, Greece, and eventually Rome itself. As the Jesus movement expanded, it encountered a breathtaking array of languages, dialects, and educational traditions. This sheer cultural diversity makes it absolutely impossible to apply a single, sweeping generalization regarding the literacy levels of early believers. A model of literacy that might accurately describe a community of Hellenized merchants in Corinth would be completely inadequate for understanding a group of rural, Aramaic-speaking agricultural workers in Galilee. The early church was a vibrant mosaic of ethnicities and linguistic backgrounds, demanding a highly nuanced approach to our historical analysis. A Christian in first-century Palestine might have been thoroughly literate in Aramaic, largely literate in Hebrew, semi-literate in Greek, and illiterate in Latin. This linguistic stratification vividly illustrates the complexity of the ancient world. Consider the typical environment of a Jewish believer living in Jerusalem or Galilee. Their primary, everyday spoken language would have been Aramaic, the common tongue of the region, making it highly probable that any functional literacy they possessed would be in this language. Furthermore, due to the intense religious focus of their upbringing and regular synagogue attendance, they likely possessed a significant degree of literacy in Hebrew, the sacred language of the Torah and the prophets. However, as they interacted with the broader economic and administrative structures of the Roman Empire, they would encounter Greek, the universal language of commerce. They might possess enough functional Greek to conduct business or read basic public inscriptions, classifying them as semi-literate in that language. Yet, despite living under Roman occupation, they would likely remain entirely illiterate in Latin, the official language of the Roman military and elite administration, which was rarely utilized by the common populace in the eastern provinces. This tiered reality of language acquisition severely complicates any simplistic evaluation of whether an individual was simply literate or illiterate. We should not be encouraged to think of a large Christian reading and writing public in the 1st century CE. Given this intricate linguistic environment and the profound socio-economic barriers to formal education, we must radically adjust our modern expectations regarding the early church's relationship with written texts. We cannot project our contemporary reality of mass literacy and ubiquitous reading materials back onto the 1st century. The early Christian movement was not comprised of millions of individuals sitting in private studies, silently reading theological treatises by candlelight. The production of books, written on fragile papyrus scrolls, was a highly labor-intensive and prohibitively expensive endeavor. Consequently, the vast majority of believers did not possess personal libraries, nor did they have the mechanical skills required to read complex philosophical or theological arguments. Instead of a large, independent reading public, we must envision tight-knit communities where the reception of the gospel was profoundly communal, centered around the public, oral reading of scriptures and apostolic letters. All of the major literacy studies of the Greco-Roman world during the empire basically come to estimates of at most between 10 and 20% of the entire population, the latter figure being an absolute upper limit. This statistical reality provides a sobering and essential corrective to our historical imagination. Rigorous historical and demographic research into the Roman Empire consistently reveals that active literacy, which is the ability to fluently read and write complex texts, was the exclusive domain of a tiny minority. The overwhelming majority of the population, ranging from 80 to 90%, lacked these skills entirely. This demographic fact heavily underscores the absolute necessity of recognizing the early Christian environment as primarily an oral culture. The implications for understanding the Pauline corpus are massive. When Paul composed his majestic epistles, he was intimately aware that his words would be heard by the masses rather than read individually. He carefully constructed his arguments utilizing the sophisticated auditory techniques of Greco-Roman rhetoric, employing rhythm, repetition, and dynamic pacing, ensuring that his profound theological truths would powerfully resonate with a predominantly non-reading audience, capturing their hearts and minds through the transformative power of the spoken word. Literacy estimates and the veneration of Scripture. There is of course the X factor that early Jews seem to have been more concerned about the education, at least the religious education, of their children than many in that portion of the empire. While the broad demographic studies of the Greco-Roman world suggest overwhelmingly low literacy rates, the specific context of the Jewish diaspora and the early Christian communities rooted in Judaism introduces a crucial anomaly. The Jewish cultural and religious framework placed an unparalleled, distinctive emphasis on the transmission of sacred traditions to the next generation. The mandate to teach the commandments diligently to one's children fostered a deeply ingrained cultural priority surrounding religious instruction. Unlike many pagan societies where education was viewed primarily as a pathway to civic advancement or philosophical enlightenment for the elite, within the Jewish matrix, education was an absolute theological imperative. It was the essential mechanism for preserving covenantal identity amidst the overwhelming pressures of Hellenistic assimilation. Consequently, synagogues functioned not merely as places of worship, but as vital centers of learning and communal instruction, potentially elevating the baseline of functional, text-based knowledge within these communities significantly above the surrounding imperial average. What may have been of more importance was the high value early Christians placed on Scripture and the learning of and about it. This intense veneration of the sacred text was seamlessly inherited and subsequently amplified by the earliest Christian believers. For the emerging church, the Hebrew Scriptures were not obsolete historical records, they were the living, breathing, authoritative Word of God that definitively pointed to the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. The early Christians were fundamentally a people of the book. Their entire theological self-understanding, their apologetic arguments against both Jewish critics and pagan skeptics, and their internal ethical exhortations were all intricately woven from the fabric of Scripture. To participate fully in the life of the early church meant to be deeply engaged in the ongoing process of reading, interpreting, and debating these foundational texts. The intense focus on fulfilling biblical prophecy and understanding the New Covenant demanded a level of textual engagement that inherently fostered a uniquely text-centric communal culture. Because of Scripture, literacy could never really be a matter of indifference to the earliest Christians. In a community where the ultimate authority resided in the divinely inspired writings, the ability to interact directly with those writings became a matter of profound significance. While the majority of the congregation might rely on the public reading of the texts, the community as a whole could never be apathetic toward the preservation, accurate copying, and careful study of the scrolls. The necessity of defending their messianic claims from the prophets and the Psalms required that at least a core group within the community possessed advanced literary skills. The very survival and theological coherence of the movement depended upon a deep, continuous engagement with the written word. Therefore, the cultivation of literacy, the training of scribes, and the support of individuals capable of navigating complex theological documents became an essential, life-sustaining priority for the early Christian movement. Furthermore, a certain authority would clearly accrue to someone who could not merely read but could powerfully interpret the Jewish sacred books. Within this text-saturated environment, charismatic spiritual gifts alone were insufficient for sustained leadership. True authority was inextricably linked to interpretative prowess. The ability to unroll the sacred scroll, fluently read the ancient Hebrew or Greek, and compellingly demonstrate how the ancient prophecies found their ultimate realization in Jesus of Nazareth, conferred immense prestige. Individuals who possessed this rare combination of advanced literacy, theological acumen, and rhetorical skill naturally emerged as the primary teachers, apologists, and defenders of the faith. They were the ones capable of engaging in rigorous debate in the synagogue, countering sophisticated Hellenistic philosophies, and providing authoritative guidance for the newly formed house churches. Their literary capability elevated them to positions of profound influence, making their interpretations the guiding force for community belief and practice. Literacy as a criteria for Christian leadership in the early church is a factor too seldom considered. When we examine the rapid expansion and organizational stabilization of early Christianity, we frequently overlook the profound sociological implications of this demand for advanced literacy. As the church expanded and established localized leadership structures, the necessity for overseers, presbyters, and deacons who could confidently handle correspondence, manage the reading of the scriptures, and defend the apostolic traditions became paramount. The pastoral epistles, for example, explicitly emphasized the ability to teach and instruct with sound doctrine as a prerequisite for leadership. This requirement inherently restricted the highest echelons of localized ecclesiastical authority to a relatively small, highly educated demographic. Understanding this dynamic is absolutely essential for reconstructing the social architecture of the first-century church. It reveals that the movement, while radically egalitarian in its ultimate soteriological vision, practically relied upon a deeply literate, intellectually sophisticated cadre of leaders to navigate the complex theological and cultural currents of the Greco-Roman world. The oral culture, letters as surrogates for oral conversation. Literacy studies are in part based on the correct conclusion that literacy is a function of education, and we know quite well that any sort of higher education, beyond the mere learning of ciphers and rudimentary writing skills for business or personal matters, was by and large for the elite in Paul's world. When we analyze the demographic realities of the first century, we must confront the stark socio-economic divides that governed access to knowledge. The acquisition of advanced literacy, which is the ability to compose complex rhetorical arguments, engage with classical literature, and navigate sophisticated philosophical discourse, was not a public right, but a fiercely guarded privilege of the aristocracy. The intense, multi-tiered educational system, progressing from basic grammar to advanced rhetorical training, required immense financial resources, leisure time, and social standing. The vast majority of the population, engaged in grueling agricultural labor or relentless artisanal trades, might only acquire the most basic, utilitarian writing skills necessary to sign a contract or record a transaction. Therefore, when we encounter a figure like the Apostle Paul, who demonstrates extraordinary fluency in the Greek scriptures, mastery of sophisticated epistolary forms, and a deep comprehension of complex rhetorical strategies, we are undeniably dealing with an individual who emerged from a highly privileged educational background. Yet in an oral culture such as the Greco-Roman world was, a culture geared far more to learning by ear than by eye, this may not have been as crucial a matter as we might think. Despite this severe restriction on active literacy, we must radically shift our perspective to understand how information actually permeated ancient society. The Greco-Roman world was not a silent culture of private reading, it was a vibrant, cacophonous environment defined by the spoken word. The public square, the marketplace, the theater, and the synagogue were all arenas of intense oral exchange. News, philosophy, politics, and theology were debated, performed, and absorbed through the ear, not the eye. In this oral landscape, a person's inability to decode ink on papyrus did not exclude them from profound intellectual and spiritual engagement. Individuals developed staggering capacities for memorization and auditory processing. They learned complex narratives, ethical frameworks, and communal identities by listening to skilled orators, storytellers, and teachers. Therefore, the low literacy rates of the early church did not render the congregation ignorant or isolated. Rather, it meant they received and processed the gospel message through a highly developed, intensely communal auditory mechanism. Indeed, as we have stressed, literary documents in early Christianity were intended to be read aloud in the assemblies, not least because most all ancient reading was done aloud. This fundamental reality completely transforms our understanding of how the New Testament documents functioned in their original context. When the Apostle Paul dispatched a letter to the believers in Corinth or Rome, he did not envision 50 different people taking copies home to read silently in their studies. He knew his letter would arrive, the congregation would gather, and a skilled reader, likely the very courier who delivered the manuscript, would stand up and vocally perform the text before the entire assembly. Furthermore, in antiquity, even when reading privately, it was the universal custom to read aloud, sounding out the syllables, because manuscripts were typically written without spaces between the words or punctuation. The text was essentially a script waiting to be voiced. Therefore, Paul composed his epistles with a highly attuned ear for rhythm, cadence, assonance, and dramatic pauses. He utilized the techniques of a master rhetorician to ensure that when his words were finally spoken, they would strike the listening congregation with maximum emotional and theological impact. In fact, letters were seen as surrogates for oral conversation, indeed as vehicles for carrying on such conversations. The living or spoken word was primary, the written word secondary, and often no more than a record of the oral. In the ancient mindset, the ideal form of communication was always face-to-face dialogue, where the presence, gestures, and tone of the speaker conveyed the full depth of their meaning. A letter was widely regarded as a necessary, albeit inferior, substitute for this personal interaction, required only when vast geographical distances prevented a physical visit. The written document was essentially a frozen voice, a mechanism designed to bridge the gap of absence and temporarily replicate the dynamic energy of a live speech. This concept is absolutely crucial for interpreting the Pauline corpus. Paul's letters are intensely personal, frequently confrontational, and deeply passionate because he is utilizing the epistolary format to forcefully project his apostolic presence into the midst of his congregations. He writes as if he is standing right there in the room, engaging in a fierce, real-time debate with his opponents and offering desperate, heartfelt pleas to his beloved converts. The written word was merely the necessary vehicle, the ultimate goal was to sustain the vibrant, transformative power of the living, spoken conversation. The social demographics of earliest Christianity. Here would be a good place to say something about the social level of Paul's converts, as this will help focus our comments about education and literacy. To truly grasp the rhetorical sophistication of the Apostle Paul's correspondence, we must critically evaluate the sociological makeup of the audiences he was addressing. For centuries, a deeply entrenched, romanticized narrative dominated biblical scholarship, depicting the early Christian movement as an uprising composed almost exclusively of the most impoverished, destitute, and uneducated masses of the Roman Empire, a purely proletarian revolution of slaves and peasants. However, when we subject the New Testament texts to rigorous historical and sociological scrutiny, this simplistic portrait quickly disintegrates. The rhetorical complexity of Paul's arguments, his extensive use of classical legal and financial metaphors, and his expectations of communal financial support all strongly suggest a remarkably different demographic reality. If Paul was writing his intricate, highly educated, rhetorical masterpieces to an audience composed entirely of illiterate, marginalized laborers, his communicative strategy would have been a catastrophic failure. Therefore, identifying the actual social strata of his converts is absolutely essential for understanding why his literary and rhetorical approach was so incredibly effective. A recent important sociological study on earliest Christianity points out that if the early church was like all other cult movements for which good data exist, it was not a proletarian movement but was based on the more privileged classes. Modern sociological analyses of new religious movements provide a fascinating comparative lens for examining the first-century church. Extensive data demonstrates that new religious cults and emerging sects rarely find their initial, most dedicated traction among the absolute lowest rungs of society. The most destitute individuals are typically entirely consumed by the brutal, daily struggle for sheer physical survival, leaving them with little excess energy or leisure time to engage in radical theological innovation or challenge entrenched religious paradigms. Instead, groundbreaking ideological movements historically take root among those who possess a modicum of economic security, social mobility, and intellectual curiosity. These are individuals who have the requisite breathing room to question the status quo, engage in philosophical speculation, and commit their resources to a controversial new cause. Applying this sociological insight to early Christianity forcefully challenges the outdated proletarian myth and strongly implies that the movement drew substantial support from individuals situated significantly higher up the socio-economic ladder. I would not say that early Christianity was based on the more privileged classes, but I do think that Judge's conclusion that early Christianity was led and largely supported by an elite minority who were of the higher social strata of society is correct. We must be exceptionally careful not to swing the pendulum too far in the opposite direction. It would be historically inaccurate to claim that the early church was an exclusive country club for the ultra-wealthy patrician class. However, the groundbreaking work of historians like Edwin Judge has definitively proven that the vital infrastructure of the early Christian movement, which includes its leadership, its financial stability, and its logistical networks, was profoundly dependent upon a highly influential, relatively elite minority. Within the congregations of Corinth, Ephesus, and Rome, we find clear evidence of wealthy benefactors, successful merchants, civic officials, and independent artisans. These individuals possessed the large domestic spaces required to host the house churches, the financial means to support itinerant missionaries like Paul, and the vital social connections necessary to protect the vulnerable new community. They formed the intellectual and organizational backbone of the church, ensuring its survival and rapid expansion. Far from being a socially depressed group, the Christians were dominated by a socially pretentious section of the population of big cities. When we analyze the urban centers of the Pauline mission, a startlingly dynamic picture emerges. The early Christian movement was not hiding in the shadows of rural obscurity, it was fiercely competing in the bustling, highly competitive environment of the great Greco-Roman metropolises. The individuals who gravitated towards leadership roles within these urban congregations were often characterized by a degree of social ambition and intellectual pretense. They were individuals deeply concerned with status, honor, and eloquence, which were values highly prized in the broader Hellenistic culture. This reality perfectly explains why the Corinthian church, for example, was so dangerously enamored with the flashy, sophistic rhetoric of rival teachers, and why Paul had to expend such immense energy rhetorically deconstructing their arrogant assumptions about wisdom and power. Paul was intentionally engaging with an audience that appreciated sophisticated argument, possessed the educational background to track complex theological reasoning, and demanded a level of communicative excellence that mirrored the high-stakes, socially pretentious environment of the ancient urban landscape. Paul's urban mission and the cultivation of a literate audience. Beyond that, they seem to have drawn on a broad constituency, probably representing the household dependents of leading members. While we have firmly established the critical presence of an influential, elite minority within the early church, we must also recognize that these congregations were beautifully diverse microcosms of Roman society. The ancient household, the fundamental building block of the Greco-Roman social order, extended far beyond the nuclear family. It encompassed extended relatives, numerous slaves, freedmen who still owed obligations to their former masters, and various clients who depended on the patriarch's patronage. When a wealthy, high-status individual, such as Stephanas in Corinth or Philemon in Colossae, converted to Christianity, the immense social gravity of their decision naturally pulled their entire extensive household into the orbit of the new faith. Consequently, the house churches became radically inclusive spaces where wealthy merchants worshipped shoulder to shoulder with their own domestic servants and indentured laborers. This unprecedented mingling of diverse socio-economic classes under a single roof created a unique, highly complex pastoral challenge for the Apostle Paul, requiring him to craft messages that could simultaneously challenge the arrogant assumptions of the wealthy elite while profoundly comforting and empowering the marginalized dependents. The peasantry and persons in slavery on the land were the most underprivileged classes. Christianity left them largely untouched. It is a sobering historical reality that the explosive, transformative energy of the early Christian movement did not immediately penetrate every layer of the ancient world. The absolute lowest, most brutally oppressed echelons of society, the millions of destitute agricultural peasants bound to the soil, and the vast armies of slaves subjected to horrific conditions in the rural estates and imperial mines, remained largely isolated from the initial wave of apostolic preaching. These individuals were trapped in a relentless, grueling cycle of physical survival, utterly disconnected from the vibrant intellectual and social networks of the great cities where the Christian message was primarily circulating. The tragic isolation of the rural poor underscores the distinctively urban character of the Pauline mission. Early Christianity was fundamentally a phenomenon of the metropolis, thriving in the bustling streets, the intellectual crossroads, and the commercial hubs of the Roman Empire, leaving the vast, silent agricultural hinterlands waiting for centuries before the gospel would fully take root among them. What is of importance for us at this point is that Paul not only engaged in an urban strategy of ministry that would put him in contact with the more well-educated and literate in the first place, but he deliberately presented his message in a way that attracted a cross-section of society including the literate. Paul's missionary methodology was neither random nor accidental, it was a highly calculated, brilliantly strategic campaign. He deliberately bypassed small villages and rural outposts, relentlessly targeting the massive, culturally dominant capital cities like Ephesus, Corinth, and Rome. He recognized that these urban centers were the vital nerve centers of the empire, concentrating wealth, political influence, and, crucially, educational resources. By establishing robust communities in these strategic hubs, Paul guaranteed that his message would intersect with the most educated, philosophically engaged, and highly literate segments of the population. However, Paul's genius lay not merely in his geographical strategy, but in his rhetorical adaptability. He masterfully presented the gospel utilizing the sophisticated intellectual frameworks and persuasive techniques of the Hellenistic world, making the radical message of a crucified Jewish Messiah intellectually compelling and irresistible to educated Greeks and Romans, thus successfully forging a wildly diverse, cross-sectional community. Indeed, it attracted enough of the literate population to make letter writing a viable means of regularly nurturing distant converts in the faith. The ultimate vindication of Paul's strategic urban mission and his highly sophisticated rhetorical approach is the very existence of the New Testament epistles. If Paul had only succeeded in converting completely illiterate, uneducated populations, the concept of sending incredibly dense, complex, and lengthy written documents to them would have been an exercise in absolute futility. The fact that Paul relied so heavily on the epistolary format as his primary instrument for long-distance pastoral care proves beyond any shadow of a doubt that his congregations contained a critical mass of highly educated, functionally literate individuals. These literate leaders were fully capable of receiving his letters, comprehending his intricate theological arguments, recognizing his brilliant rhetorical maneuvers, and effectively communicating those profound truths to the broader, listening assembly, ensuring that the transformative power of Paul's written word would endure and shape the church for millennia to come. Paul's formative education, a Pharisee from Tarsus raised in Jerusalem. We have already pointed out that Paul was both a Roman citizen and a Pharisee. To truly comprehend the intellectual depth, the cultural agility, and the profound rhetorical power of the Apostle Paul, we must rigorously examine the extraordinary foundations of his identity and education. Paul was a man who simultaneously inhabited and perfectly navigated two entirely different, often diametrically opposed, worlds. On one hand, he possessed the rare and highly coveted status of Roman citizenship, an elite legal classification that afforded him immense political protection, social prestige, and the right to due process across the vast expanse of the empire. On the other hand, he was a deeply committed, highly trained Pharisee, a member of the most rigorous and intellectually demanding sect within first-century Judaism, entirely devoted to the meticulous interpretation and flawless application of the Torah. This unprecedented dual identity, functioning as a loyal son of the covenant who also possessed the keys to the imperial kingdom, provided Paul with a uniquely powerful vantage point. It equipped him with an unparalleled cultural bilingualism, allowing him to passionately debate scripture in the synagogue one day, and confidently demand his legal rights before a Roman magistrate the next. The former placed him in the elite category of Greco-Roman society already, the latter potentially placed him among the elite in Jewish society. We must not underestimate the immense social capital that Paul inherited and cultivated. Roman citizenship was not widely distributed among the conquered peoples of the eastern provinces. It was an exclusive privilege, often granted as a reward for extraordinary military service or substantial financial contribution to the state. Possessing this status immediately elevated Paul's family above the vast, subjugated masses, placing them within the upper echelons of the provincial socio-economic hierarchy. Simultaneously, his rigorous initiation into the Pharisaic tradition propelled him into the intellectual elite of the Jewish world. The Pharisees were deeply respected for their profound theological scholarship, their uncompromising ethical standards, and their authoritative influence over the religious life of the common people. By excelling within this demanding scholarly environment, Paul positioned himself as a rising star within the most prestigious theological circles of his generation. He was, by every conceivable measure of the ancient world, a member of the elite, possessing both the secular pedigree and the sacred credentials to command immense respect and authority. In particular, his being a Pharisee meant, quite apart from the confirmation we get from Acts, that Paul likely mainly cut his educational teeth in Jerusalem. When we consider the trajectory of Paul's intellectual development, his affiliation with the Pharisees acts as a definitive geographical and educational marker. While Tarsus, his birthplace, was a renowned center of Hellenistic learning and philosophy, the epicenter of intense, authoritative Pharisaic scholarship was undeniably Jerusalem. To become a recognized master of the ancestral traditions, a young, ambitious scholar like Saul would naturally gravitate toward the theological heart of the Jewish world. Even if we completely ignored the historical accounts provided by the Book of Acts, the sheer depth of his scriptural knowledge, his mastery of complex rabbinic interpretative techniques, and his fierce zeal for the traditions of the Fathers heavily imply that his most formative, advanced theological training must have occurred within the shadow of the temple, immersed in the vibrant, fiercely competitive intellectual atmosphere of the Holy City. Luke tells us that Paul received his essential education not in Tarsus, but rather in Jerusalem. I am a Jew born in Tarsus in Cilicia, but brought up in this city at the feet of Gamaliel, educated strictly according to our ancestral law. Fortunately, we are not left to mere speculation regarding the geographical locus of Paul's education. The historical narrative of Acts provides explicit, autobiographical confirmation. In a dramatic defense speech delivered before a hostile crowd in Jerusalem, Paul proudly proclaims his prestigious pedigree, stating unequivocally that while he was born in Tarsus, he was fundamentally raised and educated right there in Jerusalem. Furthermore, he explicitly names his primary mentor, the legendary Rabbi Gamaliel, one of the most revered and brilliant sages of the first century. To sit at the feet of a master teacher like Gamaliel was to receive the absolute highest caliber of theological training available in the ancient Jewish world. This rigorous, elite apprenticeship guaranteed that Paul possessed a comprehensive, flawless mastery of the Hebrew scriptures, the oral traditions, and the complex mechanics of Jewish legal debate. It is this profound, unmatched theological foundation, acquired in the very heart of Jerusalem, that ultimately provided Paul with the intellectual arsenal he needed to become the greatest reader and theological architect of the early Christian Church. Hellenistic Jerusalem and the matrix of Paul's bilingual literacy. Self-evidently it means that Paul learned to read and write not just in Greek, but also in the sacred language Hebrew and likely also Aramaic. When we recognize that Paul underwent his primary, elite educational formation in Jerusalem under the tutelage of the great Rabbi Gamaliel, the immense scope of his linguistic capabilities becomes immediately apparent. To engage in the highest levels of Pharisaic scholarship, Paul absolutely had to possess a flawless, deep literacy in Hebrew, the ancient and sacred language of the Torah and the prophets. He would have spent countless hours analyzing the minutiae of the Hebrew text, memorizing vast portions of Scripture, and debating complex legal interpretations. Furthermore, to effectively communicate and argue within the daily, vibrant reality of first-century Palestine, he must have been entirely fluent in Aramaic, the common spoken language of the region. However, Paul was also a Roman citizen born in the diaspora, meaning his native, primary language of intellectual expression and international communication was undoubtedly Greek. This extraordinary trilingual fluency, mastering the sacred Hebrew, the colloquial Aramaic, and the universal Greek, provided Paul with a massive, unprecedented communicative advantage, allowing him to seamlessly traverse cultural boundaries and articulate profound theological concepts to entirely different audiences with equal power and precision. Through the offices of Herod the Great, Jerusalem had become a cosmopolitan and in some respects almost Hellenistic city, complete with hippodrome and Greek theater. We must radically discard the outdated notion that first-century Jerusalem was an isolated, culturally insulated, purely traditionalist enclave cut off from the broader currents of the Roman Empire. By the time the young Saul arrived to begin his studies, the city had been fundamentally transformed by the massive, ambitious architectural and cultural projects of Herod the Great. Herod, deeply enamored with Greco-Roman culture, had aggressively modernized the city, injecting it with the unmistakable hallmarks of Hellenistic civilization. He constructed a magnificent Greek theater for dramatic performances, a sprawling hippodrome for chariot races, and a massive amphitheater for athletic competitions. The physical landscape of Jerusalem was a striking, provocative blend of the sacred Jewish temple and the monumental architecture of a cosmopolitan Roman metropolis. This environment meant that a student in Jerusalem was not cloistered away from the intellectual and cultural developments of the broader world, but was actively immersed in a dynamic, highly contested synthesis of Jewish tradition and Hellenistic innovation. It must have proved extremely attractive to many Greek-speaking Jews from the diaspora, such as Paul's parents. This vibrant, newly cosmopolitan atmosphere in Jerusalem created a powerful magnetic pull for wealthy, highly educated, and deeply devout Jewish families living scattered across the vast Roman diaspora. For individuals like Paul's parents, who possessed Roman citizenship and were firmly entrenched in the Greek-speaking world of Tarsus, the prospect of sending their brilliant son back to the spiritual homeland was incredibly appealing. Jerusalem now offered the perfect, highly unique combination, the absolute pinnacle of rigorous, authoritative Pharisaic theological training at the feet of the greatest sages, seamlessly coupled with a cosmopolitan, Greek-speaking environment that would not alienate a young man raised in the diaspora. This dynamic made Jerusalem the ultimate educational destination, allowing a diaspora Jew to fully embrace their ancestral heritage without having to completely abandon the intellectual and linguistic sophistication they had acquired living in the broader Hellenistic world. It is telling that of the inscriptions from the period in Jerusalem 33% are in Greek and another 7% are bilingual. To truly appreciate the profound extent to which Greek culture had penetrated the very heart of Judaism, we need only look at the hard, archaeological evidence recovered from first-century Jerusalem. When historians and archaeologists examine the burial ossuaries, monumental dedications, and public signage from this era, a startling statistical reality emerges. A full one-third of all discovered inscriptions are written entirely in Greek, and an additional 7% feature both Greek and Semitic languages. This physical evidence shatters the myth of a monolingual, exclusively Aramaic-speaking Jerusalem. It proves definitively that a massive, highly influential segment of the city's population, particularly the wealthy elites and the vast numbers of returned diaspora Jews, lived, conducted business, and memorialized their dead using the Greek language. In this deeply Hellenized, bilingual environment, a brilliant young student like Paul could easily pursue advanced studies in the Torah while simultaneously honing his formidable skills in Greco-Roman rhetoric, fully preparing him to become the ultimate, culturally agile apostle capable of carrying the gospel from the steps of the temple to the very heart of the Roman Empire. Advanced rhetorical training within a Jewish educational context. The point in time when formal education began for both pagan and Jewish boys was about 6 years of age. To understand the sheer depth and rigor of the Apostle Paul's intellectual formation, we must trace his educational journey back to its very inception. In the ancient Mediterranean world, across both the pagan and Jewish cultural divides, the formal, structured education of young boys commenced at an incredibly early age, typically around their 6th year. This was not an era that delayed academic engagement. The cultivation of the mind was considered an urgent and foundational priority. For a young, highly intelligent boy like Saul, born into a family possessing the elite status of Roman citizenship, this early education would have been intense and comprehensive. From the moment he was capable of systematic learning, he would have been immersed in the demanding process of acquiring literacy, mastering complex grammatical structures, and absorbing the foundational texts of his culture. This rigorous, early initiation into the world of intense academic discipline set the trajectory for his entire life, forging the incredibly sharp, disciplined intellect that would eventually produce the most profound, theologically dense, and rhetorically sophisticated documents in the history of early Christianity. The importance of such an early start and thorough grounding in Jewish traditions was clearly impressed on the Jews in Palestine and elsewhere, not least because they feared simply being amalgamated into the syncretistic Greco-Roman culture. Within the specific context of the Jewish diaspora, this early, intense educational focus carried an even deeper, desperate existential significance. The Jewish people, scattered across the vast expanse of the Roman Empire, were constantly surrounded by the overwhelming, seductive power of Hellenistic culture, philosophy, and polytheistic religion. There was a profound, pervasive fear among devout Jewish families that without a massive, intentional educational effort, their children would simply be absorbed and assimilated into the dominant pagan culture, losing their unique covenantal identity forever. Consequently, the education of a young Jewish boy was not merely an academic exercise, it was an absolute theological imperative, a fierce battle for survival. From the earliest possible moment, children were relentlessly saturated in the narratives of the patriarchs, the demands of the Torah, and the uncompromising monotheism of their ancestors. This thorough, defensive grounding ensured that when a brilliant young mind like Paul later encountered the sophisticated allure of Greco-Roman philosophy and rhetoric, his core identity and profound allegiance to the God of Israel remained absolutely, unshakably secure. Thus the conclusion of J. Murphy O'Connor is fully warranted that already in the context of the home but also later in school Paul would have been thoroughly grounded in the scriptures, perhaps in the Septuagint first, and then the Hebrew scriptures. Recognizing this intense, defensive educational environment perfectly aligns with the conclusions of leading historical scholars regarding Paul's intellectual development. The brilliant historian Jerome Murphy O'Connor rightfully emphasizes that long before Paul ever set foot in the prestigious lecture halls of Rabbi Gamaliel in Jerusalem, his foundational theological worldview had already been permanently forged. This intensive scriptural indoctrination began at the very hearth of his family home in Tarsus and continued through his primary schooling. Because he was raised in a Greek-speaking diaspora, it is highly probable that his initial, most formative encounters with the sacred texts were through the Septuagint, the majestic Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. However, as his education progressed and his scholarly ambitions drove him to Jerusalem, he would have been forced to master the original Hebrew scriptures, diving into the linguistic depths of the ancient texts. This layered, bilingual immersion in the Word of God created a theological depth in Paul that was virtually unmatched in his generation. The detailed study of Paul's OT citation supports the conclusions that he regularly consulted and followed the Greek OT, and that he seems to have also known the Hebrew text as well. This complex, multifaceted educational background is not merely a theoretical historical reconstruction, it is definitively proven by the hard, textual evidence embedded throughout Paul's surviving epistles. When modern scholars conduct microscopic analyses of the hundreds of Old Testament quotations, allusions, and echoes woven into letters like Romans and Galatians, a fascinating, highly sophisticated pattern emerges. The data overwhelmingly demonstrates that Paul was intimately familiar with the Septuagint, frequently relying on its specific Greek phrasing to construct his most crucial theological arguments and rhetorical proofs. Yet, simultaneously, there are numerous instances where his citations intentionally deviate from the Greek, clearly reflecting a direct, independent engagement with the underlying Hebrew text. This remarkable capacity to seamlessly oscillate between the Greek and Hebrew scriptural traditions vividly demonstrates the incredible breadth of his education. It proves that Paul possessed an elite, bilingual mastery of the sacred texts, perfectly equipping him to deploy his formidable rhetorical skills to persuade both Greek-speaking Gentiles and highly educated Jewish scholars of the truth of the gospel. The complexities of ancient letter writing and Paul's epistolary prowess. Welcome to this advanced seminar session where we will dive deep into the core arguments surrounding Paul as both a master reader and an incredibly prolific writer. To truly comprehend the staggering magnitude of the Pauline epistles, we must first completely immerse ourselves in the material and economic realities of first-century Mediterranean life. Our textbook paints a very clear and sobering picture of this historical reality, stating, in a time long before printing presses, typewriters, and computers, letter writing was an arduous task, and if one did it very much, a somewhat expensive one. When we think about writing a letter or an email today, we absolutely take for granted the effortless ease with which we can procure paper, ink, or a digital screen. However, in the ancient Greco-Roman world, every single element required for written communication was considered a luxury item. Papyrus was immensely costly, ink had to be meticulously mixed from soot and water, and the writing reeds had to be carefully selected, intricately sharpened, and constantly maintained throughout the drafting process. The sheer financial burden of producing a monumental theological document the length of the Epistle to the Romans or 1 Corinthians would have been astronomical for the average working-class citizen of that era. This undeniably means that whenever Paul decided to compose a letter, it was a major, heavily calculated investment of time, money, and human resources. The textbook further details this incredibly laborious physical effort by noting, Pliny the Elder aptly describes the process of making papyrus. First one takes the papyrus reed and splits it with a needle into very thin and wide strips. The strips would be laid horizontally and vertically and woven together. The papyrus is put in presses and dried in the sun. This intricate and backbreaking manufacturing process meant that writing materials were not just prohibitively expensive, but they were also highly delicate and required incredibly specialized knowledge to use effectively. One could not simply hastily scribble a rough draft, make a mistake, and throw the parchment away. Every single inch of papyrus was exceedingly precious and had to be utilized with maximum efficiency. Because of this intense physical and economic reality, our text draws a very logical and profound conclusion, stating, "It is not surprising, in view of all that was involved in gathering the necessaries and preparing to write, that persons who did a lot of writing relied heavily on secretaries who were skilled in the whole process." This represents a monumental paradigm shift for how we read and interpret the New Testament texts today. The historical Paul was not sitting completely alone in a dimly lit room furiously writing these theological masterpieces entirely by his own hand. Instead, he was the brilliant mastermind and orchestrator of a highly complex, fiercely collaborative, and deeply expensive communicative enterprise. He worked alongside a trained amanuensis, or professional secretary, who knew exactly how to prepare the expensive materials, take rapid dictation, and format the text according to standard conventions. Understanding this collaborative and highly resource-intensive undertaking elevates our appreciation for the entire Pauline corpus, forcing us to recognize these texts not merely as spontaneous, casual correspondence, but as highly crafted, rigorously planned, and resource-intensive rhetorical masterpieces designed to change the very fabric of early Christian communities. The role of the amanuensis and epistolary co-authorship. As we continue our deep textual analysis of the Pauline corpus, we must transition from the physical materials of writing to the actual human mechanics of how these sacred texts were drafted, authorized, and eventually read to the congregations. In the ancient world, reading and writing were highly specialized and guarded skills that required extensive, rigorous training, far beyond basic elementary literacy. Our textbook highlights a critical feature of ancient Greek manuscripts, stating, Greek texts were written in what was called scriptio continua, that is without division between words, without punctuation or accents, and without paragraphing. Imagine, if you will, staring at a dense, unbroken block of capitalized Greek letters stretching endlessly across a papyrus scroll with absolutely no spaces, commas, or punctuation marks to guide your eyes, your inflection, or your breath. This format, universally known as scriptio continua, made silent, private reading virtually impossible for the average person in antiquity. Texts were fundamentally designed and destined to be read aloud in a public setting. Because of this daunting continuous script, the person delivering the letter could not just hand it over to the local congregation and walk away. They had to be intimately familiar with the text beforehand, knowing exactly where to pause, what syllables to emphasize, and how to accurately convey the author's original emotional tone and forceful rhetorical intent. This structural reality requires us to completely rethink the role of Paul's close associates. Furthermore, the textbook directly challenges our modern Western assumptions about solitary authorship by asserting, the naming of another person in the address was anything but a meaningless convention. Neither was it simply pro forma to say, we, even if one meant, I, in a letter. When Paul deliberately includes names like Timothy, Silas, or Sosthenes in the opening lines of his letters, he is not merely being polite or sending a casual, friendly greeting. In the strict Greco-Roman epistolary tradition, formally including someone's name in the sender's address indicates a profound level of epistolary co-authorship. These co-senders were active, recognized participants in the apostolic ministry and highly likely had a significant hand in drafting, extensively reviewing, or formally authorizing the theological contents of the discourse. This heavily collaborative dynamic completely transforms our understanding of apostolic authority, shifting it away from a model of solitary dictation toward a much more communal, orchestrated theological enterprise. We also must deeply consider how these vital letters physically reached their far-flung destinations across the dangerous Roman Empire. The text points out, it was a regular practice in antiquity to commend the letter-bearer to the recipients in some way. Paul did not likely entrust his letters into the hands of just anyone. We see this vividly and wonderfully illustrated in Paul's letter to the Romans, where he warmly commends Phoebe, or in Colossians with the faithful Tychicus. The letter-bearer was not just an ancient, anonymous postman, they were Paul's highly trusted proxy, his voice, and his apostolic emissary. They were solely responsible for the complex oral performance of the letter, essentially preaching Paul's written sermon live to the gathered house church. They would have fielded immediate questions, clarified difficult theological arguments on the spot, and conveyed Paul's deeply personal affections and pastoral concerns. Therefore, the combined presence of professional secretaries, active co-authors, and highly skilled letter-bearers vividly demonstrates that the Pauline epistles were deeply communal projects from their very inception to their final, dramatic oral delivery. Modifying Greco-Roman epistolary conventions for theological aims. Having established the collaborative and expensive nature of ancient writing, we must now turn our attention to the actual structure of the letters themselves and observe how Paul brilliantly manipulated standard cultural forms to serve his divine mission. While Paul utilized the basic framework of the Greco-Roman letter, he stretched, expanded, and fundamentally transformed it into an entirely new vehicle for profound theological instruction. Our textbook draws a fascinating historical comparison, noting, the evidence as we have it from the 1st century suggests that apart from an inveterate long-winded letter writer like Cicero, Paul had few peers and no superiors in the writing of lengthy epistles. The standard, everyday letter in the ancient Mediterranean world was incredibly brief, extremely pragmatic, and typically focused entirely on mundane business transactions or very simple personal updates. An average letter might only be a few dozen words long, hastily scribbled to request supplies or confirm a safe arrival. In stark and magnificent contrast, Paul's letters are absolute literary behemoths. The Epistle to the Romans, for instance, spans over 7,000 words, representing a staggering financial cost and an unprecedented intellectual effort. By choosing to write at such an extraordinary, unparalleled length, Paul was signaling to his readers that his documents carried immense weight, unparalleled significance, and required their utmost, undivided attention. But Paul did not merely write longer letters, he fundamentally re-engineered their internal architecture. The textbook perceptively states, to these bare bones of epistolary structure, Paul adds considerable flesh. Paul tailors these elements again and again to suit his purposes. A typical ancient letter consisted of a very simple opening, a brief health wish, a short body, and a quick closing. Paul took these rigid, skeletal bones and breathed magnificent theological life into them. He completely customized the opening greetings to establish his divine apostolic authority immediately. He replaced the generic, perfunctory health wishes with deep, profound prayers of thanksgiving that cleverly foreshadowed the massive theological arguments he was about to unleash in the main body of the text. Furthermore, he seamlessly integrated soaring early Christian hymns, complex ethical catalogues, and rigorous scriptural exegesis directly into the epistolary framework. This brilliant fusion of letter and sermon created a totally unique literary genre. Finally, we must acknowledge the profoundly public nature of these documents. The text emphasizes, Paul's letters stand out from many of his day not only in their length but also because they are group communications, and as such they are often closer to official pronouncements than private correspondence. Unlike the private, intimately sealed letters between two ancient friends or business partners, Paul's epistles were explicitly written to be read aloud in the gathered assembly of the ecclesia. They were authoritative, public documents that functioned very much like imperial decrees or official civic edicts, but instead of coming from Caesar, they came from the designated ambassador of the risen Christ. This means that every single rhetorical device, every theological argument, and every ethical command was carefully calibrated for maximum impact on a diverse, listening crowd. Paul's brilliant modification of these standard epistolary conventions allowed him to effectively pastor, powerfully correct, and deeply unify his newly planted congregations from hundreds of miles away, establishing a revolutionary new mode of pastoral care. The Thanksgiving section as a rhetorical exordium. Let us now zoom in on the very beginning of Paul's letters to witness firsthand how his brilliant rhetorical strategy begins from the very first syllables. Paul does not waste a single word, even his opening greetings are heavily laden with profound theological meaning and deliberate sociological strategy. To understand this, we look at how he actively alters customary societal norms. The textbook points out, Paul also customizes the greeting. The standard Greek greeting was charion. The standard Jewish greeting was of course shalom or peace. Paul combines the two standard greetings in order to properly greet both the Gentiles and the Jews. By taking the traditional Greek greeting, charion, which means greetings or rejoice, and slightly altering it to charis, meaning grace, and subsequently pairing it directly with the deeply traditional Jewish blessing of shalom or peace, Paul creates the now famous Christian greeting, grace and peace. This is not merely a polite, friendly opening. It is a massive, calculated rhetorical move. From the very first breath of the letter's oral performance, Paul is verbally enacting the grand theological unity he preaches. He is linguistically bringing together the Jew and the Gentile into one new, unified family under the banner of Christ. But Paul's strategic brilliance extends far beyond the opening salutation. He completely revolutionizes the next standard section of the ancient letter. Our text observes, in a pagan letter a health wish or prayer often seems simply perfunctory, but Paul turns this portion of the letter into a major opportunity for prayer. Here especially we find a preview of coming attractions. In standard Greco-Roman correspondence, the sender would typically offer a very brief, highly formulaic wish to the gods for the recipient's physical health, such as, "I hope this letter finds you well." It was a meaningless societal convention. Paul takes this hollow, perfunctory space and transforms it into a robust, deeply pastoral thanksgiving prayer. But this prayer is never random, it is highly calculated. In rhetorical terms, this section brilliantly functions as the exordium, the technical introduction of a speech designed to capture the audience's attention, secure their goodwill, and subtly introduce the primary themes of the impending argument. The textbook perfectly illustrates this by stating, Romans 1 verses 8 to 17 is a clear example of how a Thanksgiving section can provide a preview of coming attractions. Paul is rhetorically shaping the prayer so it functions also as an exordium for the discourse that follows. In the opening prayer of Romans, Paul explicitly mentions his deep desire to visit them, his eagerness to impart a spiritual gift, and the foundational concept that the gospel is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. He is carefully planting the conceptual seeds that will aggressively blossom into the massive, complex theological arguments of chapters 1 through 11. By meticulously shaping his prayer to serve as a rhetorical exordium, Paul effectively primes the psychological and spiritual pump of his audience. He ensures that their minds and hearts are perfectly aligned and completely ready to receive the heavy, transformative exhortations and theological proofs that will immediately follow in the main body of the discourse. The pervasive rhetorical climate of the first century. To fully grasp the sheer power and strategy behind Paul's writings, we absolutely must step out of our modern, text-obsessed mindset and step directly into the vibrant, heavily oral culture of the ancient Mediterranean world. In the first century, society was completely saturated with the spoken word. Public speaking was not just an academic exercise, it was the primary engine of social mobility, political power, and communal entertainment. Our textbook brilliantly captures this reality, stating, in an oral culture, the ability to speak well is always important, and the ability to actually persuade is a required skill of any public figure. Rhetoric was a fundamental staple of ancient education. Any young man of means, particularly someone like Paul who was a Roman citizen with Pharisaic training, would have been rigorously immersed in the formal study of rhetoric. They would have spent years analyzing the great speeches of antiquity, learning how to structure complex arguments, and practicing the intricate physical gestures and vocal inflections required to captivate a large audience. Rhetoric was the absolute lifeblood of the Greco-Roman world. But we must be very careful to define what rhetoric truly meant in this ancient context. The text clarifies, rhetoric, though it might degenerate into the art of speaking well, was in essence the art of persuasion. True rhetoric was not merely about using fancy vocabulary, sophisticated grammar, or putting on a theatrical, entertaining show. While the so-called sophists of the day often engaged in that kind of empty, performative display, the classical Aristotelian tradition viewed rhetoric as a highly serious, philosophically grounded endeavor. Its ultimate and defining goal was persuasion, the ability to tangibly change an audience's deeply held beliefs, their societal behaviors, and their future actions. Because Paul's absolute ultimate goal was to convert hearts to Christ and radically shape the behavior of his newly formed churches, he naturally and heavily utilized the immense power of classical rhetoric. To analyze his letters properly, we must understand the specific tools he had at his disposal. The textbook expertly outlines these, noting, there were three primary kinds of rhetoric, each tooled to suit a particular setting: judicial or forensic rhetoric for use in the law courts, deliberative rhetoric, meant to be used in the assembly, and epideictic rhetoric, meant to be used in funeral oratory or public speeches lauding some event or person. These three classical species form the foundational bedrock for all ancient speeches. Forensic rhetoric focuses entirely on the past, seeking to attack or defend someone's previous actions, much like a modern courtroom trial. Deliberative rhetoric focuses sharply on the future, attempting to advise, persuade, or dissuade an assembly regarding a specific future course of action or behavioral change. Finally, epideictic rhetoric focuses entirely on the present moment, seeking to lavishly praise or severely blame a person or a concept, often used to reinforce shared communal values. As we will see in the subsequent slides, Paul was a masterful, unparalleled architect who deliberately chose and seamlessly combined these specific rhetorical forms to perfectly address the unique, volatile crises erupting within his various congregations. Galatians as polemical deliberative rhetoric. Let us now apply these classical rhetorical categories to one of Paul's most fiery, passionate, and heavily debated letters, the Epistle to the Galatians. For centuries, scholars have intensely argued over the exact nature of this letter because of its incredibly sharp, defensive, and almost aggressive tone. However, when we look at it through the strict lens of ancient rhetorical theory, its true purpose becomes brilliantly clear. The textbook introduces this by stating, Galatians is one of the most obviously rhetorical of all Paul's letters. It includes the usual epistolary framework at the beginning and at the end, but for the most part it is pure speech material. When you strip away the very brief opening greeting and the final closing remarks, what you are left with in Galatians is essentially a full-fledged, high-stakes public oration. It is a speech desperately crying out to be passionately delivered. Because Paul spends the first two chapters vigorously defending his apostolic calling and aggressively recounting his past conflicts in Jerusalem and Antioch, many commentators have mistakenly concluded that this is a piece of forensic rhetoric, a legal defense of his past actions. But this is a critical misreading of Paul's ultimate goal. Our textbook corrects this incredibly common error, emphasizing, the issue here is not whether Paul had been right in what he had said or done, but what they themselves were going to believe and to do. Paul is not writing to the Galatians simply to clear his own name or to win a historical debate about his apostolic credentials. The Galatian churches are in the midst of a massive, life-altering crisis. Rival teachers, often called Judaizers, have infiltrated the community and are aggressively demanding that these Gentile converts submit to physical circumcision and strictly obey the Mosaic law to be truly saved. Paul's absolute, singular objective is to stop them from making this disastrous future decision. Therefore, the letter must be definitively classified differently. The text solidifies this argument by noting, forensic rhetoric has no place for exhortations such as we find in Gal 5:1, 6:10. Exhortations belong to the deliberative form of rhetoric and are part of the attempt to persuade or dissuade about a future course of action. If Galatians were merely a forensic legal defense, it would logically end once Paul proved his innocence. But it doesn't. The entire letter dramatically climaxes in chapters 5 and 6 with intense, rapid-fire ethical exhortations, desperately pleading with the Galatians to stand firm in their freedom, to violently reject the yoke of slavery, and to actively walk by the Spirit. These types of commands and future-oriented warnings are the absolute hallmark of deliberative rhetoric. Even though Paul uses a highly polemical, emotionally charged, and defensive tone early in the letter to fiercely establish his credibility, that tone is merely a strategic tool. The overriding, defining architecture of the entire discourse is entirely deliberative, expertly designed to aggressively persuade the Galatian assembly to reject the rival teachers and definitively choose the path of grace for their immediate future. Structural analysis of the Galatians' discourse. Now that we have definitively established that Galatians operates as a piece of deliberative rhetoric, we must meticulously break down its internal structure to see exactly how Paul brilliantly executes this classical form. In ancient rhetorical handbooks, a proper speech was divided into very specific, highly functional sections, such as the exordium, the narratio, the propositio, the probatio, and the peroratio. Paul follows this ancient blueprint with astonishing precision in Galatians. Let us focus specifically on the first two chapters, which have caused so much confusion. Our textbook brilliantly clarifies this, stating, the function of the narratio in chapters 1 to 2 is precisely what Aristotle says a deliberative narratio ought to do, speak of things past in order that being reminded of them, the hearers may take better counsel about the future. In classical rhetoric, the narratio is the formal statement of facts. It is the section where the speaker recounts the historical background of the current crisis. When Paul spends 2 entire chapters recounting his intense conversion, his deeply private meetings with the Jerusalem pillars, and his explosive, public confrontation with Peter in Antioch, he is not just randomly venting his frustrations. He is masterfully constructing a deliberative narratio. By reminding the Galatians of exactly how fiercely he fought to preserve the pure truth of the gospel in the past, he is providing them with the ultimate, undeniable historical precedent. He is showing them the exact standard of behavior they must adopt right now to secure their future. Furthermore, the textbook points out a crucial contextual clue, noting, Paul says this is a discourse for the assemblies in Galatia, 1:2, another indication that this is a deliberative act of persuasion. The very term, assemblies, or ecclesiae, invokes the deeply rooted civic tradition of the ancient Greek democratic assembly, the exact historical venue where deliberative rhetoric was born. Paul is essentially calling the Galatians into a formal, high-stakes assembly meeting to aggressively debate and decisively vote on the future direction of their entire community. To win this critical vote, Paul employs specific types of logical proofs. The text summarizes the epistolary framework at the beginning and at the end, but for the most part it is pure speech material. Arguments about harm or advantage are deliberative arguments. In the central body of the letter, the probatio, Paul repeatedly argues that if the Galatians submit to circumcision, Christ will be of absolutely no advantage to them, and they will be severely, permanently harmed by falling away from grace. This intense, binary focus on future communal advantage versus catastrophic spiritual harm is the absolute, defining essence of Aristotelian deliberative theory. By mapping the strict rules of classical rhetoric directly onto the text of Galatians, we unlock Paul's underlying genius. We see a master orator who perfectly weaves his deeply personal history into a razor-sharp, technically flawless argumentative structure, all designed to rescue his beloved converts from an impending theological disaster. Philippians and the rhetoric of concord. Let us now drastically shift our geographical and emotional focus from the fiery, battle-torn region of Galatia to the deeply beloved, albeit slightly fractured, community in Philippi. Here, we encounter a very different pastoral tone, yet we remarkably find the exact same underlying rhetorical architecture at play. Philippians is another absolute masterpiece of Pauline persuasion, but it is calibrated for an entirely different communal crisis. The textbook introduces this shift by stating, another fine example, of a little shorter length, is the deliberative argument for concord and harmony found in Philippians. Just like Galatians, the epistle to the Philippians is fundamentally a piece of deliberative rhetoric. Paul is once again writing to persuade an entire assembly to adopt a very specific future course of action. However, the exact nature of the problem in Philippi requires a vastly different rhetorical touch. The textbook highlights this crucial contrast, noting, whereas Galatians sought to head off harm and enhance advantage for Paul's converts, Philippians deals in classic fashion, by appeal to multiple examples, with the issue of producing harmony, unity, and oneness of mind among believers in Philippi. In Galatia, Paul had to aggressively use the rhetoric of dire warning to stop a theological catastrophe. In Philippi, the threat is not necessarily a massive external heresy, but rather a dangerous internal fracturing. There is murmuring, complaining, and a highly public dispute between two prominent female leaders, Euodia and Syntyche. Therefore, Paul deploys the classic Greco-Roman rhetoric of concordia, the urgent, passionate plea for civic and communal harmony. To achieve this profound unity, Paul relies heavily on one of the most effective tools in the deliberative arsenal, the use of vivid, historical examples. Throughout the letter, Paul brilliantly lines up a series of positive and negative models for the Philippians to emulate or entirely avoid. He presents his own joyful suffering as an example of steadfastness. He holds up Timothy and Epaphroditus as shining paragons of selfless, sacrificial service. And most magnificently, in chapter 2, he presents the ultimate, supreme example of the self-emptying, incredibly humble Christ. By stacking these powerful examples, Paul is creating a devastatingly effective comparative argument, visually showing the Philippians exactly what true unity and humility look like in action. Finally, the structure of the letter perfectly concludes according to strict rhetorical guidelines. The text points out, the concluding peroratio includes a statement of the qualities or virtues one looks for in such examples, 4-8-9. In the peroratio, or the grand emotional conclusion of the speech, Paul issues his final, sweeping appeal. He commands them to fiercely concentrate their minds on whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, and whatever is pure. He is passionately summarizing the very virtues beautifully embodied by the examples he just provided, driving home his ultimate plea for them to radically alter their communal behavior. Philippians proves that Paul's incredible rhetorical skill was highly flexible, allowing him to use the exact same deliberative framework to aggressively fight off vicious heretics in one city, while gently but firmly repairing broken friendships in another. Digressions and epideictic embellishments in the Corinthian correspondence. We now turn our analytical gaze to the incredibly chaotic, notoriously unruly, and deeply fractured church in Corinth. Paul's correspondence with the Corinthians represents some of his most complex, exhausting, and rhetorically sophisticated work. The sheer volume of profound dysfunction in Corinth required Paul to stretch his rhetorical abilities to their absolute maximum limits. Looking first at 1 Corinthians, our textbook states, 1 Corinthians is also, as a whole, another excellent example of deliberative rhetoric, almost 4 times as long as that we find in Philippians. Once again, we find Paul employing a massive deliberative framework to desperately urge a divided community toward profound future unity. However, because 1 Corinthians is so incredibly long, addressing countless issues ranging from rampant sexual immorality to chaotic lawsuits, and highly disruptive worship practices, Paul faced a very real danger, audience fatigue. Ancient rhetorical theorists like Quintilian strictly warned that a speaker who drones on relentlessly with endless logical proofs will inevitably lose the attention and the vital emotional connection of their listeners. To combat this, master orators utilized a specific technique. The text explains, if one thing was imperative in a long speech, some interesting or entertaining digressions were necessary. We find this very phenomenon in 1 Cor 13, an excellent and poetic example of showpiece epideictic rhetoric in praise of love. This is an absolutely crucial insight. For generations, scholars have mistakenly viewed the famous love chapter, 1 Corinthians 13, as a completely random, oddly placed poetic insertion. But through the lens of ancient rhetoric, it makes perfect, brilliant sense. It is a highly calculated digressio, a deliberate, beautiful detour. Furthermore, it shifts gears from deliberative argumentation to soaring epideictic rhetoric, the specific rhetoric of lavish praise and stunning display. By halting his intense, harsh scolding and delivering a breathtakingly beautiful, poetic eulogy on the absolute supremacy of divine love, Paul brilliantly captivates the Corinthian audience's exhausted attention. He completely wins their hearts with overwhelming beauty, making them incredibly receptive to the heavy, difficult arguments that will immediately follow in chapter 14 regarding spiritual gifts. Now, when we look at the intensely emotional 2 Corinthians, the overall structure dramatically changes. The text observes, 2 Corinthians is essentially a lengthy piece of forensic rhetoric with two significant deliberative digressions in 6:14, 7:1 and in 8-9, digressions which nevertheless serve the larger forensic purposes of this document. Because Paul's very apostolic authority, his profound integrity, and his personal character were under vicious, unrelenting attack by rival superapostles in Corinth, he had to completely switch tactics. 2 Corinthians is primarily a forensic document, a fierce, emotional, and aggressive legal defense of his past behavior and his unshakable apostolic legitimacy. Yet, even within this intense defensive trial, Paul expertly weaves in deliberative digressions, such as his passionate plea for the financial collection in chapters 8 and 9. He masterfully proves that a highly trained rhetorician could flawlessly mix genres, using deliberative detours to ultimately strengthen his overarching forensic defense, showcasing an unparalleled mastery of ancient persuasive techniques. The anthropological and theological insights revealed by Paul's rhetoric. As we bring this intensive seminar session to a close, we must step back and ask the ultimate, overarching question: what does Paul's masterful, intricate use of classical Greco-Roman rhetoric actually tell us about his deepest theological convictions and his profound view of humanity? The application of these ancient persuasive techniques is not merely a superficial stylistic choice, it reveals the very beating heart of his apostolic methodology. Our textbook provides a profound, clarifying insight, stating, Paul's use of rhetoric reminds us that he was concerned to reach his audience where he found them, which meant he had to use means of communication that worked with the largely Gentile audience with which he was dealing. Paul was absolutely not a rigid, culturally isolated sectarian who demanded that the entire Gentile world immediately adopt obscure, foreign modes of communication to understand the gospel. Instead, he was the ultimate, brilliant contextualizer. He deeply understood that to successfully plant the seeds of the Christian gospel into the incredibly hard, resistant soil of the pagan Roman Empire, he had to speak the cultural and intellectual language of the people. By masterfully employing the deeply familiar, highly respected tools of Aristotelian and Ciceronian rhetoric, he made the radical, scandalous message of a crucified Jewish Messiah incredibly intelligible, intellectually respectable, and culturally accessible to a vast, skeptical Gentile audience. But even more profoundly, his use of rhetoric reveals a stunningly high view of human dignity and personal freedom within the newly formed Christian community. The textbook observes, Paul's use of rhetoric or persuasion reminds us of Paul's commitment to freedom, to the old Greek value of democracy touted in the old assemblies. By consistently choosing to use deliberative rhetoric, the exact specific form of speech originally designed for the free, democratic, voting assemblies of ancient Athens, Paul is making a massive, radical sociological statement. He views the local church, the ecclesia, not as a mindless, robotic cult demanding blind, terrified obedience to a religious dictator, but as a free, mature, and intellectually capable assembly of deeply responsible citizens of heaven. The text brilliantly concludes, the art of persuasion is used on those that it is assumed have the capacity to respond freely and positively to something when convinced of its merits, even when the exhortation is not just about belief, but also about behavior. If Paul believed his converts were incapable of rational thought, or if he simply wanted to rule them through fear, coercion, and sheer apostolic intimidation, he would never have bothered using complex, logical rhetorical proofs. The very fact that he expends immense energy to passionately argue, desperately plead, and logically persuade them overwhelmingly demonstrates his profound theological belief that humans, liberated by the Spirit of Christ, possess the beautiful, God-given capacity to freely choose the good, to deeply understand truth, and to voluntarily align their communal behavior with the glorious reality of the gospel. Paul the Reader is ultimately Paul the Liberator. An educated and articulate persuader. But how does rhetoric help us to understand the apostle himself and what sort of person he was? First, it reminds us that we are dealing with a well-educated and articulate person. Let us unpack this profound statement and consider its immense implications for our historical and theological understanding of early Christianity. For many centuries, both in popular religious imagination and even in some academic circles, a somewhat romanticized but historically inaccurate portrait of the Apostle Paul has prevailed. He is often envisioned as an isolated, spiritually overwhelmed figure who traversed the Mediterranean world relying purely on spontaneous bursts of divine inspiration to deliver his message. However, when we apply the rigorous tools of ancient rhetorical analysis to his surviving epistles, a drastically different and far more compelling picture emerges. We are forced to recognize that Paul was a man of significant and elite intellectual pedigree. In the context of the first-century Greco-Roman world, the ability to articulate complex theological concepts and ethical arguments in a highly persuasive manner was not a common trait, rather, it was the definitive hallmark of an elite, rigorous educational background. Rhetoric was the absolute crown jewel of ancient education, requiring years of dedicated study and practice. By analyzing the intricate structures, the sophisticated tropes, the carefully crafted exordiums, and the emotionally resonant perorations within his letters, we observe a mind that has been profoundly disciplined by intense academic study. This perspective does not in any way undermine the role of divine inspiration in his ministry. Instead, it illustrates that a highly trained intellect was utilized to engage with the greatest philosophical and rhetorical minds of his era. His undeniable ability to weave together Jewish scriptural exegesis with Greco-Roman diatribe, alongside his masterful deployment of pathos and logos, definitively points to a highly educated intellect. Paul was no rustic, backwoods preacher simply rattling off whatever exhortations that came to mind. To the contrary, these letters reflect significant learning, skill, organization, and preparation before one dons the mantle of the great persuader. To fully comprehend the profound weight of this observation, we must delve deeply into the actual mechanics of ancient communication and literature. In Paul's historical context, constructing a formal letter, especially a lengthy, meticulously argument-driven epistle such as his letter to the Romans or 1 Corinthians, was an incredibly labor-intensive and expensive process. It required not merely the services of a professional scribe and costly papyrus, but also profound structural organization and brilliant strategic foresight. While a rustic, uneducated preacher might deliver a fiery but entirely unstructured sermon, the letters we possess from the Apostle Paul are undeniable masterpieces of strategic, rhetorical architecture. He meticulously planned his arguments, adeptly anticipating the objections of his opponents through the established rhetorical technique of refutatio, and he built his case piece by careful piece so that his final emotional appeals would land with maximum persuasive impact upon his listeners. This extraordinary level of preparation is precisely indicative of someone who has thoroughly and completely mastered the ancient art of persuasion. When we refer to Paul as donning the mantle of the great persuader, we are formally acknowledging that he consciously, deliberately, and expertly employed the vast tools of his educational background to relentlessly advance his mission. He implicitly understood that to successfully capture the minds and the hearts of his incredibly diverse audiences across the empire, he could not simply rely on unpolished religious zeal. He fundamentally needed the structured, compelling, and undeniable force of formal rhetoric to achieve his groundbreaking goals. Reaching the audience where they are. Second, Paul's use of rhetoric reminds us that he was concerned to reach his audience where he found them, which meant he had to use means of communication that worked with the largely Gentile audience with which he was dealing. To fully appreciate this strategic adaptation, we must consider the monumental demographic shift that occurred during the early expansion of the Christian movement. As the gospel message transitioned from its original, culturally specific Jewish context in Judea and Galilee out into the vast, pluralistic Greco-Roman diaspora, the established methods of communication had to evolve. If Paul had simply utilized traditional Jewish midrashic arguments or localized rabbinic debate styles exclusively, his message would have been largely unintelligible to the pagan populations of cities like Corinth, Ephesus, or Philippi. Therefore, Paul's adoption of Hellenistic rhetorical forms was born out of profound pastoral and missional necessity. He understood that effective communication requires speaking in a register that the listeners already comprehend and respect. By utilizing the recognized structural norms of the ancient speech, such as the exordium and the narratio, Paul was essentially bridging a massive cultural divide. He validated the intellectual framework of his Gentile audience, signaling to them that the Christian message was not merely a bizarre foreign superstition, but a philosophically rigorous and intellectually robust truth worthy of their full attention. This adaptation was a brilliant execution of his famous claim to become all things to all people so that by all possible means he might save some. He wanted his proclamation and persuasion to be a word on target, not merely a shot in the dark. This meant that Paul would seek to use all the available ancient tools of persuasion to achieve his ends, so long as basic ethical commitments and commitments to truth were not violated. The metaphor of a word on target perfectly encapsulates the precision of Paul's rhetorical strategy. He did not simply broadcast generic spiritual truths into the ether and hope they would land favorably. Rather, he customized his arguments to address the specific civic, philosophical, and social contexts of each unique congregation. For instance, when addressing the philosophically minded Athenians at the Areopagus, he quoted their own Greek poets and utilized the rhetorical structure of a sophisticated apologia. When writing to the factionalized Corinthians, he employed deliberative rhetoric specifically designed to produce concord and political unity. However, it is equally critical to note the strict ethical boundaries Paul maintained within this strategic flexibility. In an era where sophistic rhetoricians often prioritized flowery style, flattery, and emotional manipulation over actual substance, Paul strictly refused to compromise the integrity of the gospel. He utilized the legitimate, established tools of persuasion taught in the tradition of Aristotle and Quintilian, but he explicitly rejected the deceptive, empty showmanship of the sophists. His rhetoric was always anchored in profound theological truth and rigorous ethical commitments, proving that one can be culturally relevant and highly adaptive in communication without ever sacrificing the foundational purity and truth of the message being delivered. Appealing to the whole person, logic and pathos. He also knew enough about Mediterranean temperament to know that all the logic in the world without pathos would not likely appeal, much less persuade. To deeply understand the effectiveness of Paul's letters, we must transport ourselves into the vibrant, highly expressive culture of the ancient Mediterranean world. This was an incredibly agonistic, competitive society where public discourse was dramatic and theatrical. In this specific cultural climate, an argument that relied exclusively on dry, sterile logic, known as logos, would be perceived as entirely insufficient and uncompelling. The ancient audience expected to be moved. They demanded that a speaker engage their deepest feelings and ultimate loyalties. Paul, possessing a brilliant understanding of this Mediterranean temperament, masterfully orchestrated his epistles to satisfy the rigorous intellectual demands of his audience while culminating in devastatingly powerful emotional appeals, known in rhetoric as pathos. We see this dynamic beautifully illustrated in the book of Romans. Paul spends chapter after chapter building a dense, legally and theologically complex argument regarding justification, sin, and the law. But he does not leave the argument in the purely intellectual realm. He drives this logic forward until it erupts into the soaring, triumphant emotional climax of Romans chapter 8, where he passionately declares that absolutely nothing in all creation can separate us from the love of God. By weaving together undeniable logic with profound pathos, Paul ensured that his letters resonated with earth-shattering force. As Pascal once said, the heart has reasons that the mind knows not of, and so Paul sought to appeal to the whole person, so that by all means he might win some. To win some in an ancient, rhetorically saturated environment, one's speech needed to be winsome. This insightful reference to Blaise Pascal perfectly illuminates the holistic anthropology underlying Paul's rhetorical methodology. In the Greco-Roman marketplace of ideas, human beings were never viewed merely as disembodied intellects, they were understood to be complex creatures driven by deep desires, affections, and loyalties. Therefore, if Paul was truly committed to his stated goal of winning people to the gospel of Christ, he had to address the entirety of the human condition. In a society that was absolutely saturated with competing philosophers, itinerant preachers, and professional orators, a message had to be exceptionally compelling and aesthetically pleasing, or what we might call winsome, to gain any traction whatsoever. Paul recognized that theological truth, no matter how objectively accurate, must be presented in a manner that captures the imagination and stirs the soul. We witness this holistic appeal powerfully in his second letter to the Corinthians, particularly in chapters 10 through 13. Here, Paul defends his apostolic authority not simply by citing credentials, but by pouring out his heart, recounting his intense physical sufferings, his shipwrecks, and his deep anxiety for the churches. He makes himself exceptionally vulnerable, utilizing the rhetoric of the fool's speech to disarm his arrogant opponents and bind the affections of the Corinthian believers back to himself. By engaging both the rigorous logic of the mind and the profound reasons of the heart, Paul proved himself to be a master communicator who understood that true, lasting persuasion requires winning the whole person. At home in the Gentile world. Furthermore, rhetoric tells us that Paul was very much at home in the Gentile world. Though a Jew, he would not have seemed a stranger to Gentiles. This observation is incredibly critical for dismantling the false dichotomy that is often imposed upon the Apostle Paul. While he famously described himself as a Hebrew of Hebrews and a former zealous Pharisee, we must simultaneously hold in tension his identity as a Roman citizen hailing from the prominent city of Tarsus. Tarsus was renowned throughout the empire as a major, flourishing center of Hellenistic education and philosophical inquiry. Because Paul was thoroughly steeped in this cosmopolitan environment from his youth, he possessed a remarkable fluency in the cultural, philosophical, and rhetorical forms of the Greco-Roman world. When he stood before a pagan audience, whether in a bustling marketplace or a formal civic assembly, he did not project the aura of an isolated, incomprehensible foreigner from a distant, obscure religious sect. Instead, his rhetorical polish, his vocabulary, and his confident manner of disputation would have immediately identified him to his listeners as a recognizable and respectable figure, akin to the traveling philosophers or professional rhetoricians who were common features of civic life. This inherent cultural legibility granted Paul an enormous strategic advantage. It allowed him to seamlessly enter the public square, secure an audience, and command intellectual respect in the Gentile world before he even began to articulate the specific, scandalous claims of the Christian gospel. He could speak their language, and he was prepared to fellowship with and even live with them, at great cost to his Jewish heritage and friendships, even his Jewish-Christian friendships, as Galatians shows. It is clear that Gentiles were willing to listen to and be persuaded by such a person. The profound commitment Paul exhibited toward his Gentile audiences extended far beyond mere linguistic fluency or rhetorical adaptation. It required a radical and incredibly costly lifestyle incarnation. To truly persuade the Gentiles, Paul understood that he could not merely preach at them from a safe, culturally sanitized distance. He had to enter their homes, eat at their tables, and fully share in their daily lives. In the deeply segregated society of the first century, where strict Jewish dietary laws and purity codes severely restricted interaction with non-Jews, Paul's willingness to engage in unrestricted table fellowship with Gentiles was utterly revolutionary and highly controversial. As the vivid historical account in the second chapter of Galatians reveals, this radical inclusivity came at a tremendous personal cost to Paul. It provoked severe conflict with the more conservative Jewish Christian factions from Jerusalem, leading to a painful and public confrontation even with the Apostle Peter. Yet, Paul was absolutely willing to sacrifice his own social comfort, his traditional standing, and even his lifelong Jewish heritage friendships to break down the dividing wall of hostility. It was precisely this unparalleled level of relational authenticity and sacrificial solidarity that made his rhetorical arguments so deeply effective. The Gentiles were remarkably willing to listen to and be persuaded by Paul because they saw a man who did not just speak their language intellectually, but who loved them enough to fully share their lives, validating his message with his very existence. Sifting and transforming Greco-Roman culture. Paul's use of rhetoric also reminds us that Paul desired to be a part of a larger world than many of his Jewish Christian contemporaries who were dragged kicking and screaming into a more cosmopolitan church. The early decades of the Christian movement were marked by profound internal tension regarding the cultural trajectory of the faith. Many prominent figures within the original Jerusalem church, who were deeply anchored in traditional Judean customs, envisioned Christianity primarily as a localized renewal movement within the boundaries of Judaism. They were highly suspicious of the broader pagan world and were intensely resistant to incorporating uncircumcised Gentiles into the covenant community without requiring strict adherence to the Mosaic law. In stark contrast to this insular, separatist tendency, Paul possessed a breathtakingly expansive, universal vision for the gospel. He boldly recognized that the message of the resurrected Christ was intended to shatter ethnic boundaries and establish a genuinely global, multi-ethnic family of faith. His masterful adoption of Greco-Roman rhetoric was the very vehicle that facilitated this broader, inclusive vision. By utilizing the universally understood language of Hellenistic persuasion, Paul was actively dragging the nascent Christian movement out of its provincial origins and propelling it onto the global stage of the Roman Empire. His rhetorical strategy was the practical manifestation of his profound theological conviction that the Church was destined to be a vast, cosmopolitan church, transcending all localized cultural limitations. It reminds us that Paul valued a good deal of Greco-Roman culture. He was not one to condemn every aspect of Greco-Roman culture. Rather, he believed in sifting culture, not merely criticizing it. Paul's faith was not in a world-negating religion but rather in a world-transforming one. This represents a massive and crucial corrective to how Christians often view their relationship with secular society today. Paul did not view the surrounding pagan culture as a totally irredeemable wasteland that must be entirely boycotted or feared. He did not advocate for a world-negating asceticism where believers isolate themselves in holy enclaves away from the contamination of society. Instead, Paul engaged in the highly sophisticated and discerning process of sifting culture. He carefully evaluated the philosophies, the poetry, the civic structures, and the rhetorical forms of the Greco-Roman world, actively retaining what was noble, true, and useful, while boldly subverting and challenging its underlying idolatries. We see this vividly when he confidently quotes pagan poets like Aratus and Menander to build theological bridges with his audience, or when he utilizes the standard civic language of political assembly to describe the local church congregation. Paul essentially hijacked the cultural machinery of the empire, repurposing its finest elements to serve the advancement of the kingdom of God. This dynamic approach demonstrates that Paul believed the gospel was fundamentally a world-transforming power. He taught that believers are called to actively engage with their surrounding Greco-Roman culture, redeeming its language and its structures to effectively communicate the lordship of Christ over every single aspect of human civilization. The assembly as a democratic space of persuasion. Lastly, Paul's use of rhetoric or persuasion reminds us of Paul's commitment to freedom, to the old Greek value of democracy touted in the old assemblies. To truly grasp the radical nature of Paul's vision for the local church, we must explore the historical and political origins of the specific terminology he chose to employ. When Paul referred to the gatherings of believers, he consistently utilized the Greek word ecclesia. In the ancient Hellenistic world, the ecclesia was not originally a religious term, it was a deeply political one. It referred specifically to the formal, democratic assembly of free citizens in a Greek city-state who were summoned together to debate public policy, pass laws, and govern their community. By deliberately co-opting this highly charged civic term to describe the Christian gatherings, Paul was making a profound statement about the nature of the church. He was effectively establishing the church as an alternative polis, a new kind of heavenly city operating within the earthly empire. Crucially, because the original Greek assemblies were defined by the free exchange of ideas and the necessity of convincing fellow citizens through reasoned debate rather than through sheer tyrannical force, Paul's relentless use of formal rhetoric mirrors this democratic ideal. He treated the members of his congregations not as mindless subjects to be ordered around, but as free, intelligent citizens of the kingdom who needed to be engaged through respectful, intellectual, and theological persuasion. This highlights his deep structural commitment to the inherent dignity and freedom of the believer. The Christian assemblies in homes could be replicas of that old assembly, if they were places of discourse, dialogue, debate, and persuasion. To be sure, Paul could and would command, if driven to it, but he would far rather win an audience's compliance in matters theological, ethical, and social. This paints a fascinating and vibrant picture of what early Christian gatherings actually looked like. They were not characterized by top-down, authoritarian monologues delivered in absolute silence. Rather, the house churches were highly dynamic, interactive spaces designed for rigorous discourse, theological dialogue, and genuine debate. While Paul undeniably possessed ultimate apostolic authority and was certainly capable of issuing strict commands when a community was in severe moral peril, his overwhelming preference was always to utilize rhetoric to gently but firmly win the hearts and minds of his listeners. We see this preference exquisitely displayed in his short, brilliant letter to Philemon. Paul explicitly states that while he could boldly command Philemon to free his runaway slave Onesimus, he preferred to appeal to him on the basis of love, using the rhetorical technique of insinuatio to gently guide Philemon toward making the righteous decision voluntarily. Paul understood a profound theological truth: forced compliance produces only begrudging submission, but a mind and heart that have been genuinely won through loving persuasion will produce lasting, joyful obedience. Therefore, the Christian assemblies were designed to be transformative environments where believers were continually persuaded by the truth of the gospel, resulting in authentic, voluntary changes in their ethical and social behavior. Cultivating a cosmopolitan community. Paul, as a collectivist, longed for a community that voluntarily lived in harmony and did what they ought to do to serve one another in love, and freely share Christ with the world. When we read the letters of Paul through our modern, 21st-century Western lenses, we frequently and mistakenly project our own cultural framework of hyper-individualism onto the text. We tend to view salvation and spirituality primarily as a private, personal transaction between the individual and God. However, Paul operated within a profoundly collectivist ancient culture, where a person's core identity, honor, and purpose were inextricably derived from their membership within a larger group. Consequently, for Paul, the ultimate goal of the gospel was never merely the aggregation of disconnected, individually saved souls. His deepest pastoral longing and overarching theological objective was the creation of a unified, tightly knit, and visibly harmonious covenant community. This supreme value of community cohesion, often referred to in antiquity as concordia, is the driving force behind almost all of his deliberative rhetoric. For example, his entire letter to the Philippians is a masterful rhetorical exercise designed explicitly to eliminate toxic rivalry and cultivate a deep, voluntary unity of mind and spirit. Paul knew that this profound communal harmony could not be legislated by external force; it had to be cultivated voluntarily as believers were persuaded to joyfully lay down their rights and serve one another in sacrificial love. This visible, voluntary unity was, in Paul's view, the ultimate apologetic tool required to freely and effectively share the reality of Christ with a fragmented, warring world. Rhetoric then reveals to us a Paul committed to and drawing on a great Greco-Roman heritage and working toward a great Christian community, a cosmopolitan family that embodied the best of both Jewish and Gentile worlds. In the final analysis, the study of Paul's rhetorical strategies unveils the magnificent, synthesizing genius of his life's work. He did not view his Jewish theological heritage and his Greco-Roman cultural environment as mutually exclusive or inherently contradictory domains. Instead, he drew deeply upon the rich, ancient heritage of Greco-Roman philosophy, civic terminology, and rhetorical persuasion, and he seamlessly married these elements to the profound ethical monotheism and scriptural promises of his Jewish faith. The glorious result of this unprecedented synthesis was the creation of a totally new humanity, as he describes it in his letter to the Ephesians. Paul was tirelessly laboring to construct a truly global, cosmopolitan Christian family that actively shattered the seemingly insurmountable ethnic, social, and cultural barriers of the ancient world. In his newly formed communities, the rigorous morality and historical depth of Judaism were brilliantly combined with the universalizing language and intellectual accessibility of Hellenism. This breathtaking vision of a unified, multi-ethnic family of God stands as the ultimate triumph of Paul's theological mind and his rhetorical prowess. He utilized the very best intellectual tools of the ancient world to forge a cosmopolitan family that demonstrated to the Roman Empire what a truly redeemed, unified, and loving human society was actually meant to look like. The objection of Deisman regarding social status. The argument goes back to A. Deisman in the early part of the last century and goes something like this: Paul was by no means a member of the social elite in the Greco-Roman world. As we establish the highly educated and rhetorically sophisticated nature of the Apostle Paul, we must directly confront and systematically dismantle a very prominent counterargument that has heavily influenced New Testament scholarship for over a century. In the early 20th century, a brilliant and highly influential German scholar named Adolf Deisman published groundbreaking research comparing the Greek vocabulary of the New Testament with the newly discovered, everyday papyri found in the rubbish heaps of Egypt. Based on this linguistic comparison, Deisman formulated a sweeping thesis. He argued forcefully that early Christianity was almost exclusively a proletarian, grassroots movement of the poor and uneducated masses. Consequently, Deisman concluded that Paul himself was absolutely not a member of the educated, upper echelons of society. Deisman's hypothesis gained massive traction, leading generations of scholars and pastors to view Paul essentially as a rugged, unpolished, working-class figure who stood in stark opposition to the wealthy, educated social elite of the Roman Empire. This assumption dramatically shaped how Paul's letters were interpreted, often causing readers to completely overlook the profound literary and rhetorical complexities embedded within the text, simply because they assumed a lower-class author was incapable of such sophistication. Paul's sometimes awkward Greek and various aspects about his person, especially his trade of tent-making, locate Paul socially several rungs below the Ciceros of the ancient world. Paul partook of the character and social level of most of his converts, which is to say at best the artisan or lower class of Greco-Roman society. Deisman built his influential case on a few specific pillars of evidence. First, he pointed to moments in Paul's letters where his Greek grammar appears slightly awkward or features abrupt, broken sentences, known as anakoeuthon, contrasting this with the flawless, highly polished literary prose of a Roman aristocrat like Cicero. Second, and most importantly, Deisman heavily emphasized Paul's well-documented manual labor as a tent-maker, or leatherworker. In the rigid, aristocratic hierarchy of the Greco-Roman world, working with one's hands for a daily wage was generally viewed with immense disdain and was considered highly degrading, suitable only for slaves and the lowest classes of citizens. Furthermore, Deisman leaned on Paul's own statement in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, where Paul reminds the church that not many of them were wise by human standards, and not many were powerful or of noble birth. From this, Deisman extrapolated that Paul totally partook of the lower-class character of his converts, classifying him strictly within the lowly artisan demographic. While this theory was revolutionary in its time for highlighting the everyday, accessible nature of the New Testament language, it ultimately relied on a fundamental misunderstanding of the extreme complexities of first-century social stratification and completely ignored the overwhelming evidence of Paul's actual rhetorical genius, which we will address in our next point. Stepping down the social ladder. Paul was a multicultural person, and while it is true that working with one's hands was considered demeaning by the Greco-Roman elite, this was certainly not the view of first-century Jews, nor was it the view of Greco-Roman artisans either. To properly refute Deisman's reductionist view of Paul's social status, we must recognize the incredible multicultural complexity of Paul's identity. It is a fatal historical error to judge Paul strictly by the aristocratic prejudices of the Roman elite. While a Roman senator would certainly view manual labor as degrading and shameful, this was absolutely not the perspective of the Jewish culture in which Paul was rigorously raised. Within first-century Judaism, honest manual labor was viewed with immense dignity and profound respect. In fact, it was a standard expectation that even the most elite, highly educated rabbis and scribes would possess a practical trade to support themselves, ensuring they did not profit unethically from teaching the Torah. Furthermore, even within the broader pagan world, the Greco-Roman artisans themselves took fierce, dignified pride in their craftsmanship and their crucial role in the urban economy. Therefore, the mere fact that Paul engaged in the manual labor of tent-making does not automatically disqualify him from possessing a high-level education or hailing from a background of significant social standing. We must evaluate him as a complex, first-century Jew who seamlessly navigated multiple, overlapping cultural spheres. I would agree with E. Judge and other social historians that in Paul we find a person deliberately stepping down the social ladder in order to reach as wide an audience for the sake of the gospel as was possible. Part of that stepping down was a deliberate taking up by Paul of his trade from time to time. This brings us to a massively important breakthrough in modern sociological studies of the New Testament, pioneered by scholars like E. Judge. Instead of viewing Paul simply as a lower-class laborer, social historians recognize in Paul a fascinating phenomenon known as status inconsistency. Paul clearly possessed incredibly high status markers. He held the highly coveted privilege of Roman citizenship, and he boasted an elite, rigorous Pharisaic education under Gamaliel. Yet, despite these elite credentials, Paul made the astonishing, voluntary decision to deliberately engage in low-status activities, such as working a sweaty manual trade and enduring the shameful, degrading physical punishments of floggings and imprisonments. This was not a consequence of his birth, it was a deeply strategic and profoundly theological choice. Paul was intentionally stepping down the social ladder. He was actively mimicking the very trajectory of the gospel he preached, the gospel of the divine Christ who willingly emptied himself, taking the lowly form of a servant, as beautifully articulated in the Philippians Christ hymn. By deliberately taking up his trade, Paul stripped away the intimidating barriers of wealth and aristocratic privilege, allowing him to connect intimately and authentically with the widest possible demographic, ensuring that his message was accessible to everyone from slaves to city officials. Foregoing patronage and the strategic rationale for tent-making. It seems clear from a text like 1 Cor 9 that Paul admits he deserved to be remunerated for his work of sharing the gospel, but he chose not to accept the offers of money from various Corinthians because it would enmesh him in the social networks of patrons and clients. To fully understand the brilliance behind Paul's lifestyle choices, we must grasp the foundational economic and social engine of the ancient Greco-Roman world, the system of patronage. In this deeply ingrained societal structure, relationships were largely defined by reciprocal obligations between a wealthy, powerful benefactor, known as the patron, and a dependent subordinate, known as the client. If a traveling philosopher or rhetorician accepted significant financial support or housing from a wealthy aristocrat, they instantly became a client. This meant they were socially bound to praise their patron, endorse their views, and serve their personal interests. In his first letter to the Corinthians, Paul explicitly argues that as an apostle of Christ, he possesses the absolute theological and moral right to receive full financial remuneration from the churches he serves. Yet, he makes the shocking, voluntary decision to aggressively refuse their money. He did this because he recognized that accepting funds from the wealthy elite in a status-obsessed city like Corinth would instantly ensnare him in this toxic web of patronage. To become a client to a wealthy Corinthian would utterly compromise his apostolic independence, severely restrict his freedom to preach hard truths, and critically divide his loyalty. The reasons, as I see them, do not involve the conclusion that Paul was just carrying on with his trade as he always did everywhere. To the contrary, he did it in Corinth to avoid patronage and to have ease of access through the marketplace to various of the ordinary people that would frequent the market. Paul's manual labor, therefore, was not the desperate, inescapable reality of a permanently lower-class artisan, it was a highly calculated, brilliant missional strategy. By intentionally setting up a leather-working shop, known as an ergasterion, in the bustling commercial heart of the city, the marketplace or agora, Paul secured total financial independence. He was beholden to no wealthy patron, allowing him to preach the gospel with uncompromised boldness and integrity. Furthermore, this setting provided an unparalleled, phenomenal strategic advantage for evangelism. The ancient workshop was a highly social, interactive environment. As Paul worked with his hands, perhaps during the massive influx of tourists for the famous Isthmian Games, he had direct, unmediated access to a constant stream of customers, travelers, and ordinary citizens. He could engage in deep, philosophical, and theological discourse, utilizing all his elite rhetorical training while simultaneously stitching leather. Therefore, Paul the tent-maker is the ultimate testament to Paul the reader. He seamlessly integrated his profound intellectual education with the gritty reality of daily labor, creating a completely uncompromised, highly effective platform from which to persuade the Greco-Roman world of the lordship of Jesus Christ.